this book 40 years ago. So from the very time I started writing the book, I had this title in my head. That's what I wanted to call it. So every time a book came out on hotels, I hope nobody's ditched the title. So it was still there when I was ready to publish just back in 2023. When I started writing this book, it was just meant to be a coffee table book. If you're sort of into history, some of you may know of a book called The Place of Consequence by Rees and Pascoe. Has anybody seen that book? It's a little coffee table book, only about 10,000 words, maybe less, but a lot of pictures. And that's what I hoped my book was intended to be when I started it in 1983. But then you start to go to the Batty Library and you get one gem of information, and then it becomes a bit like a search for gold. You want one nugget and you want to find another. So over time, I found more material than I needed for one book. I finished up with a book length of 300,000 words. So a couple of years ago, I went away with my sons and I said, boys, what am I going to do with this book? And they said, Dad, nobody's going to buy a book of 300,000 words. So I'm publishing it as a trilogy. So so this book is a trilogy. So the full title is called 1829 to 1929. So we're really looking at the first 100 years of hotels. But as much as the title's got an emphasis on the INNS, it's as much about the outs of Fremantle as it is the hotels. So if you're thinking, look, I wouldn't mind getting a property, it's just not really about hotels. It's about the social history of Western Australia in those first 100 years. It talks about sort of the political elite, and it talks about the length of balls. We have a totally different appreciation of the way balls were sort of conducted. They would start around about 10 o'clock in those days. Then they'd have their supper at midnight, and then they'd go to 3 or 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning. And those sort of stories are revealed in these books that I'm publishing over the next 3 years. So this one's published already. Book number 2 is coming out quite soon, and book number 3 is a little bit later on down the track. So, but in a moment, I'm going to get into the storytelling of the book. But when you look at this book, somebody says, oh, it's like a road map. Well, in a way, it is a road map, but more particularly, it's a road map. That is the map that is shown there. It's a sort of fine-tuning of the map by Surveyor General Road of Fremantle in 1833. And all the red dots there represent where a hotel has stood in inner Fremantle since we've been sort of going as a state. So they highlight, and there's a key there that sort of gives the names, and further inside there's a bigger key that shows you their age and things like that. So that is a map of all those hotels, and I'll be making reference to some of those. As I go through my talk, I will make some reference to hotel names, and I'll give you a bit of an idea where they are. But because you're in Maylands, you may not know them as well as if you were a Fremantle person, but I won't hold that against you. Because more importantly, I want to say how good it is to be invited here tonight, to be actually standing in one of these great old hotels. You know, it's a real treat to actually be giving a talk like that in one of these magnificent kind of colonial time hotels, more like Federation really in their age. But you go to the Fremantle, and they're all my books about the old hotels of Fremantle, but there's only about 4 of those old hotels still trading these days. Even this one doesn't trade as a hotel. But you've got all these small boutique hotels, and they've just got no sort of, who's got an interest in those? So it's nice to be here tonight. But with that said, you've come to listen to my story, and I'm going to be reading off a prepared script, so I'll take questions at the end of the evening if you'd like. So anyway, I'll start now with my prepared script. So my book starts with the very first colonists for Western Australia, or Swan River Colony, as it was known for the first years of its existence. And it has to be said that these early colonists did not know what to expect or what they were letting themselves in for. Indeed, there was one colonist on the Parmelia, that's Captain Sterling ship that he was sailing on, who in a letter which they sent back to England from Cape Town wrote, after our arrival at the land of promise, we shall probably find temporary homes prepared for us by the Challenger. That's Captain Fremantle's ship, because he's arrived in the colony a month ahead of Sterling. So he's already here. And the letter continued, which has been sent there for the purpose. Various exploring parties will be sent out. We expect the discovery of a range of snow-capped mountains. They'll really a bit of a surprise. The Challenger was the first ship to arrive in the colony in late April 1829, and this was followed by the Parmelia and the Sulphur a month later. By August, other ships had started to arrive in the colony, and one of these was the Marquis of Anglesey, which arrived in late August but on the 5th of September it had become wrecked on what we now know as Anglesey Point. That's just around about where Cicerello's and that are in Fremantle these days. With the ship unsalvageable, the hull of the ship was put up for sale, and a report of the sale tells how the hull of the Marquess of Anglesey was purchased by a Mr. Legg for the paltry sum of £170. His bargain was a capital one, for he immediately let the ship to the government as a public store for £100 a year. So the colony's only been going 2 months and he's already making money like that. He thought, gee, I'm going to do well in this place. And he was one of the very successful pioneers. At this time, Lieutenant Governor Stirling had not been given any authority by the Home Government to make laws or enforce them. And if you read the book, I'll explain it. I won't explain it here tonight, it's a bit complicated. So he effectively bluffed the new settlers into compliance. And one way of doing that was to make a threat that if anybody was found to be selling liquor without a licence, then they would be disqualified from being allocated a grant of land. This prompted a couple of settlers to write to the governor asking about how they could acquire a licence, but no licences were issued at this time. It was not until the 29th of December that a notice was issued calling for applications for licences that were to be issued with effect from 1st of January 1830, and 7 applications were received. At this time, Fremantle was busier and more established than Perth, for all new arrivals had to come through Fremantle before moving on to Perth to register for their land grant. Thus, there were 3 hotels licensed for Perth and 4 for Fremantle. So the inaugural publicans of Fremantle were a fellow called Robert Thompson. He owned a hotel called the Stirling Arms. That was on the corner of High and Pakenham Street, if you know those streets. If you know Fremantle today, you may know where the Navy Club is. That's the corner where that hotel was. Thompson later, but in 1832, he moved to Rottnest. He was a bit nervous with the Aboriginals. They're now being kept in the roundhouse, and there's a bit of Aboriginals around the town. So he moves to Rottnest, and that's where we get the name Thompson's Bay from. He was an early publican of Fremantle. Another hotel was William Rolfe Steele. He had a hotel called the South Sea Hall Public House, a pretty fancy name. Later changed its name to the Royal, and that shared a boundary with the Stirling Arms, so that was on the corner of High and Henry. There was another one, a publican was William Dixon. He had a hotel called George IV. That stood on the corner of High and Cliff Street, which was just near the high water mark. And if you know Fremantle again, that's where the hotel called His Majesty now stands. That was on High and Cliff Street. That's a vacant car lot now. And then there was Collins, Robert Collins, with his self-named Collins Hotel, and that was the one near His Majesty's. So that was close to the high water mark. So with that said so I've talked about where they are. Just a bit over what I got it. So of these hotels, most is known about the Stirling Arms, with a number of references being made to it either in newspapers, letters or diaries. And Captain Bailey, a visiting seafarer, wrote in his journal, Fremantle consists at present of merely a few tents and marquees, with here and there a wooden house, but these are few and far between. There is one hut which is dignified with the name of a tavern. The liquors are so well watered that not even a temperance society could find fault. Another hotel that made the news was the Collins Hotel on the banks of the river near the Rocky Bar that went across the river. This was a very treacherous bar to cross, and Robert Collins, the publican, was regularly called upon to give assistance to people who had got into trouble while crossing them. That help did not go unnoticed by the Western Australian Gazette, and on one occasion the paper told how one grateful party had rewarded him with the enormous sum of 10 shillings sterling for his trouble and promptness, so he received a reward for his effort there. However, the same paper was not so gracious when some other unfortunates were similarly rescued, and this time the paper wrote, "This is the 4th instance of Mr. Collins being ready to save the lives of fellow creatures, but sorry are we to relate that the former assistance rendered received little or no thanks." So they sort of wrote that story up differently to the other one. In October 1830, so the colony's been going a year, John Bateman, who becomes a successful pioneer, was making inquiries about obtaining a joint licence for a tavern that he owned with another gentleman on the cantonment This is on the contamination coming into Fremantle. So if you know where Shaq's Notice Art is on coming into Fremantle, this is about where this hotel was going to be. So that's its location. And when he writes asking about getting a licence, this is what he's proposed to the Colonial Secretary. He proposed building a good stone house for the accommodation of such parties who may be detained at Fremantle. Our intentions are not to allow any tippling or give any encouragement to the lower class, but to keep it as select and respectable as possible, having everything necessary for the purpose of accommodation and respectable parties. So the colony's only been going 12 months, we've already got this class structure, you know, your capitalists and your wealthy, and you're kind of looking down on the sort of working class. Bacon was issued with a licence in early 1831 for a hotel which he called the Swan. Another hotel to open around this time was the Albion, which was run by William Smithers and his wife, and this was located at Pakenham Street, down by Marine Terrace, so very close to down at the bottom of what we now know as the Esplanade. The Smithers were a bit like Bacon, for they too held high aspirations for their hotel, and in a letter written by Mrs. Smithers she wrote, "We are at present at the Albion, but we think of letting this for another and going to a hotel where we want to open as a house for genteel company." So once again, they've got this aspiration to be only looking after the toffs of the community. But the ambitions of Bacon and Smithers were naive in thinking that they could rely on genteel company for their trade. And Bacon in particular soon found that he was too far out of town to benefit from any passing trade, and the hotel had closed by 1834. So with all these fancy ideas, it didn't help him good. Another publican at this time was William Keats, but he had no luck as a publican, for it was an ill wind that blew down Henry Street and through the doors of his tavern. And if the later success of the Bateman family is associated with fame and fortune in Western Australia, then the name Keats is remembered for its infamy. So you might have you heard this name Keats before? Anybody putting their hand up? Well anyway, what about the name Yeagan? We heard of the name of Yeagan? Yeagan was one of these sort of traditional warriors, sort of standing up to protecting his sort of lands, resisting the authorities. And later on, around about 1832 or 33, there's a reward put on his head, dead or alive. He was well respected by Stirling, but nonetheless the reward was offered for him. And the two boys of this publican, Keats, the two sons of Keats, were the boys who ambushed and killed Yeagan. So they've established already some black names for themselves here in the community. One of the boys was killed in that skirmish, as was Yeagan himself. The other boy got away and he was able to collect the reward, and he was exiled out of the colony because the Aboriginals would have extracted retribution at some time. So they already kind of got this bad name. But the father of the boys actually adds to the kind of infamy of this family. There was a ship called the Cumberland that was being skippered by a sort of very prominent merchant in the town called Captain McDermott. The ship goes missing on its way up from Augusta. People knew the ship had left Augusta, but it doesn't arrive in the Fremantle when it should, and it remains missing for some time. Nobody had known what had happened to the ship. So missing, presumed, lost type of thing. But what had happened is the father, William Keats, along with some of his mates, went down by Panguin Island, had found the wreck, and then they plundered the wreck for anything that had some value, and they kept it for themselves. So that was part of the story, and they'd even found one or two of the people who had been lost at sea, but they made no effort to report it or to bury these people properly. But later on, Keats and his mates also broke into a store in Fremantle, which was found out about, so consequently they're now arrested for that, and at that time, that's when the story of the Cumberland becomes known. So the story's revealed, and they're able to sort of go, and the authorities are able to go down and collect whatever needed to be from that side. This led to a trial in Fremantle where Keats and his mates were tried, and as it turns out, he was given a sentence. In those days, short-term sentences, like something between one and a couple of days in jail or 2 years, you would spend in the roundhouse in Fremantle. But longer sentences of like 5, 7 or 14, you were sent to Tasmania or Van Diemen's Land as a convict. And that's what happens to Keats in this example. He was sentenced as a convict to Van Diemen's Land for 14 years. And in those days, the papers wrote and spoke in a different way, and perhaps a little bit more friendly than they might do today. And when he was leaving the colony, the papers written up a little bit of a story about him leaving, And it closed off its article with this description of him. It said, "He is a character better known than respected." It's just a priceless comment to me. By the end of 1833, Fremantle had improved a lot over the previous 4 years, and George Fletcher Moore, who's prominent enough around the Swan area, a noted dialist in those days described Fremantle as a town laid out in regular streets of stone houses with low walls and in some places palisades in front, 2 or 3 large well-kept inns or hotels in which you can get clean beds and good private rooms. So Fremantle's coming on, and so are the hotels. One of those hotels was that which was known as Mrs. Pace's boarding house. The building was located on the corner of High and Mowat Streets, where the P&O now stands. Anybody familiar with that corner? So that's where it starts off as. Later becomes known as the Crown and Thistle, later the Victoria, later the P&O, so it has a number of changes over time. There was no doubt that being a publican was hard and sometimes dangerous work, as Mrs. Pace found out in April 1837. By this time her boarding house was well established, and it took much more than just her family to run the hotel. While women may not have been employed to work behind the bar, they were engaged to undertake other housekeeping duties within the hotel. These women were often required to work long hours, and it was because of this that Mrs. Pace had been threatened late at night by the intoxicated Edward Sutherland, the husband of one of her workers. It was his belief that Mrs. Pace was keeping his wife at work for unreasonably long hours, sometimes up until 10 p.m. or 11 p.m, and his agitation was further compounded by the fact that while she was working, their son was playing cards with the patrons in the bar. That was not an unquestionable concern, given that the son had not been born until 1824, and so would not have been any older than 13 years of age. The Perth Gazette's report on this affray shows the extreme chauvinism of some of the men's townfolk, for when reporting on Mrs. Pace's testimony, the newspaper described how the husband held up his clenched fist at us. He turned around to his wife and gave her several blows. I tried to get out of the room, and I at last succeeded and sent for a constable. In the meantime, he had laid hold to his wife by one leg and dragged her out of the room into the street. He got her up against the wall and dealt her one of the most cruel blows I ever heard. Some of them, in speaking in his defence, gave a different version of what had happened. Among them his denial that he had struck or had attempted to strike Mrs. Pace, as well as pleading that he had meant no harm, as he only wanted his wife and thought of her as his own property. So with conflicting testimony, the magistrate was left to decide Sutherland's fate, and it seems that he too shared Sutherland's chauvinism, for he found him not guilty. By the mid-1830s, Fremantle had lost a substantial number of its population to the rural areas. So what had happened, people are coming in through Fremantle, then they're moving to Perth, they're getting the land grants, so they no longer need Fremantle as a town, and they're moving into towns like Guildford, moving on to Northern and York. So consequently, Fremantle's going now in a state of decline. And there was a comment made by Lieutenant Bunbury, who gives us the name Bunbury. He wrote at this time about Fremantle. He said, "Some good houses built in the first days of the colony are now rapidly going into decay. Many of them are half buried in loose white sand, which drifts with every breeze and smothers the fences and even walls in the town." So that was a big problem, the matter of sand drift in Fremantle. Those deteriorations were kind of led to falling prices in Fremantle, and there are other scales of that, of those falling prices. Nonetheless, the town was to get a lift from the whaling industry, with the first whalers coming into Fremantle from 1833, and which gave impetus to the formation of the Fremantle Whaling Company in 1836. That in turn led to the tunnel being dug between 1837 and 1838 with the use of prison labour from the roundhouse, including Aboriginal labour. With a whaling station being stationed on the town doorsteps, it was hard to ignore the smell emanating from Bathurst Beach, where the whaling station was. And the Perth Gazette told how the inhabitants of Fremantle must, in the course of another year, experience much inconvenience and unpleasantness from the establishment of a whaling station so near the town, and it will unquestionably become a source of great complaint. It is idle to disguise the fact that so close a neighbourhood to a slaughterhouse is a serious nuisance. If the season is protracted into the summer months, it would be intolerable. So you can just imagine with our Fremantle doctor, that smell going into the town there. The American whalers were important to Fremantle, and it was estimated that every time a whaler called into the port, it contributed £50 to the local economy. Sounds like coinage these days, doesn't it, £50? But that would have probably in those days had about a value of around $3,000 or $4,000. Probably with inflation it'd be more like $30,000. So it was pretty important money to have coming into Fremantle. But of course these are hard-working men, so going into the hotels and that, they would draw amongst themselves. They were not necessarily friends, because there would have been a lot of rivalry between those particular boats. They might have caught the other mate, a couple of boats might have had the same side on the whale, and one of the crews had got it, so there was not necessarily any friendship between these crews. And there was one time when there was a very big brawl amongst the whalers in Fremantle, and one of the sort of leaders of the brawl was heard to cry, "We want but a few more of our vessels in the harbour, and we burned a bloody town about their ears." So that would have been very scary for the people of Fremantle to be under threat from these American whalers, and that would have applied to all the small hamlets down the coast, like Vass, Dunster, Augusta, Albany. All these whalers would have been from time to time going in there and causing strife like that in Fremantle. Needless to say, in the 1840s, Fremantle was a rough and ready seaport, and one visitor to this town described how Fremantle, with its streets crowded by drunkards, reeling or fighting with its unused jail, it's a laughing stock. Have I not heard it mentioned by settlers of education and respectability that because each American whaler that touches here adds £50 to the wealth of the colony, it is incumbent on the government to tolerate the intemperance and licentiousness of the crew. So it's got the medium saying, gee, they're getting away with it because of the wealth they're bringing to the colony. Sounds like any mining town, I suppose, doesn't it? Even though the newspapers were full of stories of men and women being fined for drunkenness, there was the occasional time when they published a more light-hearted story like this one. So it was a very short little story, and it was captioned "Example of Temperance," and then it opens up with one fellow speaking to another. The first fellow says, "See here, friend, you are drunk." And the other fellow replied, "Drunk, to be sure I am, and have been for 3 years. You see, my brother and I are on a temperance mission. He lectures while I serve as a frightful example." Another tale that had some humour was the time when the American whalers played the prank on a hill settler. He hid by hiding his cart in the Fremantle barn, only to be avenged by the bushy when he hitched up their whale boat to his 4 bullocks and dragged it half a mile inland. The bushy had an even louder laugh the next day when he was paid £1 to drag it back to the shore. Another colourful tale, albeit a bit sad, is the one told by the Perth Gazette when it wrote, and this is kind of a bit of a poignant story in a way, that tells of the experience of a woman. It goes, "The public were much amused and some few shocked to see a female escorted to the lock-up in Perth on Monday last in a wheelbarrow. She was perfectly powerless from intoxication and gave the police no more trouble than wheeling an equal weight of inanimate matter would have done." So it's got its humour, it's also got its sadness with it, I think, that story. With the arrival of the convicts in June 1850, the ticket of leave holders surpassed the whalers as the best customers of the public houses. And one of the told of their drinking habits, which often got them into trouble, and which had sometimes had more dire consequences, like the misfortunate belief that fell one ticket of leave holder when he went drinking in the Perth Hotel. The inquiry told how he was served with a glass of rum and laid himself down in the corner. He was alive at 8 o'clock in the evening and was dead and stiff 2 hours afterwards. And you kind of think, didn't somebody think to tap him on the shoulder or something like that? But then you've got to see that in the context of the time. There would have been a lot of ticket of leave men. There was a big imbalance between male and female. Sort of the gender ratio was 100 men to every 76 women. So these ticket of leave men, they've got no partners. They're going into the hotels to drink and drown their sorrows, and probably a lot of his drinking mates were no better off than what he was in a way. By the 1850s, there was rumblings in the colony over both the number of hotels being licensed and the quality of accommodation. On the matter of hotel numbers, the papers had some reason for concern. So the convicts have only started to come here in WA from 1850, but that starts to spawn a growth in hotel numbers. So while Perth had only had 9 hotels in 1851, it would sort of have about 14 a year later, and Fremantle for a time stayed pretty solid, only having 5 hotels for a time, but over time that would start to increase as well. The biggest beneficiaries of convicts were the Allan farmers, who were able to use convicts as farm labourers, and the town of Fremantle, who were able to use them in public works around the town. That aggravated the people of Perth, who thought that Perth was being neglected, but they were even more upset when there was speculation that the seat of government might be transferred from Perth to Fremantle. One of the Perth people who opposed the idea was Lionel Sampson, so this is a name whose labour better connected and better remembered in Fremantle, but at this time he's in Perth. So he's a prominent Perth merchant at the time, and he had a low opinion of Fremantle, and he compared Fremantle to the docks of Wapping in London, which was intended to be a criticism of Fremantle, for Wapping was one of the most populated and notorious docklands in London. So he's taken a big swipe at Fremantle at this time while he's a Perth person. However, Governor Fitzgerald advised that it had never been contemplated to shift the seat of government, and even if he didn't have the power to make that change anyway, so it had to stay as it was. But he makes his own personal comment that he wouldn't have favoured it personally anyway, because it would have been just too expensive to live in Fremantle. So he wasn't giving it any sort of consideration at all. But that was not the end of Fremantle's ambitions to be recognised as a seat of government. And in October of 1854, the Fremantle merchants stirred up a hornet's nest when, through a public announcement, they called for a public meeting to again consider moving the seat of government from Perth to Fremantle. So they're going to have another crack at getting the seat of government to move. But one of the main people behind the Fremantle petition was Lionel Sampson, who's now jumped ship and who's now living in Fremantle. So he's now running the argument of why Fremantle should become the seat of government. And he's now being remembered for his slur against Fremantle, making it to Wapping. So for a time, people remember his disparaging comment about Fremantle being like Wapping, and for a time he was called the member for Wapping in sort of time as a member of the Legislative Council. But then there are some quotes of what Sampson said about sort of Perth. And here he said why he had spoken about Wapping, being the Wapping of Western Australia. He says it was because he referred to it as an expression used by him in the Legislative Council with reference to Fremantle. That expression was Wapping. He now wished to explain his reason for using it. It was because Wapping was extensive, and he wished Fremantle to become so. And he gets support and cheers from him, the gallery on that one. He was so well known that he was confident that anything he would say would not offend anybody, and he gets sort of support for that again. But that explanation was derided by his detractors, and thereafter Sampson, as I say, was remembered as the member for Wapping. But it was just not Sampson's leadership of this Fremantle push that set the Perth colonists against him, but they took umbrage at his assertion that Fremantle was more like the capital than Perth, in having better houses and larger families, and its inhabitants were more active and intelligent. Sampson had an insult to injury by saying Perth was only good for producing nothing but perhaps a few cabbages and blackboards. So he's really taking some swipes here at Perth now. By this time, the country towns were well established, and it was not just Perth and Fremantle who had their inter-town rivalries. And the visitor of the colony once observed how Fremantle despises Perth. York cannot bear the sight of contemptible place northern. Perth says no respectable person lives in Fremantle, and Bunbury says York is not fit for a Christian to live in. So there was really friendship between these sort of rivalry little country towns. In July 1855, Governor Fitzgerald handed over the reins of governor to Governor Kennedy, and throughout 1856 he was to alienate, this is Governor Kennedy, he was to alienate a large section of the colony with his reforms to the hotel trade. It was in May 1856 that he introduced a number of new bills to the Legislative Council, and the most contentious was the Publicans Licensing Bill, for which it was not only proposed raising the annual fee, but it also had the objective to reduce the number of public houses in the colony. In the speech delivered to the Legislative Council, Kennedy declared that all experience in other countries has proved that the multiplication of public houses is one of the most certain means of multiplying drunkenness and crime. I therefore unhesitantly state my opinion that their numbers should be restricted. So he's put it on notice that he's going to be bringing this forward to the council to hope to get the numbers reduced. This was a very contentious clause in the bill. Well, so that was his objective. But a very contentious clause in the bill was one that prohibited both women and conditional pardoning from holding a publican's licence. And while both these categories of licence holder have been included under the one clause, the Legislative Council debated them separately. While there is no verbatim statement made by the Governor that showed why he wanted to disqualify conditional pardoning, his attitude towards them can be found in the following statement when he said, "My wish is to see so many public houses licensed as necessary, and that they should be kept by men selected by the local magistrates as of impeachable character, who will aid the authorities in detecting and repressing crime rather than harbour absconding criminals." So he's taken a big swipe at the conditional pardoning and saying, I don't trust you blokes, to be honest, you're going to be fences, you're not going to be sort of upholding the law, and for that reason we're not going to be there to have a publican's licence. On the question of women holding public houses licences, the Governor's attitude to them was better understood. And I'll warn you ladies, you won't like what he said about new women as potential publicans. This is what he said about the females of the colony. He said, "Females are not hardy enough to stand behind the bar of a drunken tap room, and I cannot reconcile the possibility of a respectable woman keeping a public house. I've been much around the world and never knew such a thing. Where females kept them, it was generally combined with another less respectable occupation." So he's really taken a swipe at the women of the colony there. Such a biased opinion had no support from the press or the public, and the inquirer in its attack on the proposed legislation made the comment, "What engrossing injustice is sought to be implicated here? A poor woman, the widow it may be, of a publican who has no other means of livelihood is to be debarred from earning her bread in the manner to which she has become accustomed, and for which she may be best suited. It is monstrous." So given the public sort of opposition to that clause, it never got through, it was never passed, and women were able to keep being publicans. But I have to say that women as publicans never got the same absolute benefits of being a publican as males up until the Equal Opportunity Act of 1980. There are still different barriers to women being publicans, even through up until 1980. But I won't go into the night. But it wasn't, so they're well looked after, and in that particular fact that it wasn't proceeded with, that was very lucky for Mrs. Marmion, whose husband, Patrick Marmion, had been the publican, but only died about 6 weeks after the legislation had come through, so she was a beneficiary of the fact that it didn't get through that Parliament at that time. If not, she would have been able to hold a licence, and as it turns out, she then stayed a publican in Fremantle for about the next 20 years and was one of our Fremantle's most respected publicans, whether male or female. So yeah, as for the conditional pardon then, that was protested in the home to the Home Government, which sort of later on says, hang on, we're meant to be rehabilitating these people. If they can't be part of normal society, that's not good enough. And a year later, they had to repeal that legislation which prohibited the conditional pardoning. So anyway, the legislation also provided for the fact that the numbers had to be reduced. So by the time the legislation had gone through, Fremantle's hotel numbers had to drop down from 9 to 5, and Perth had to drop down from 11 to 8. So there's a reduction in the number of towns. So I'll just give you the hotels that get their licences in Fremantle. I won't give you too much details, but I'll give you their sort of names that you might know better of. There's a hotel called the Victoria. Now the P&O have already made reference to that. Another one, the Crown and Thistle. Later becomes the Cleo's. Does anybody know the Cleopatra? It's all down in that west end of Fremantle. Another one's the Emerald Isle, now the Orient Hotel, pretty much at the end of the block which the P&O in. Another was the Castle. If you know old Fremantle, that later becomes the Fremantle Workers Club. Later on demolished and they built a new club. But a lot of you may know the Freemasons, which is down by the markets. If you go into Fremantle, you might go to the markets, there's a hotel straight opposite, now known as the Sail and Anchor. All the other hotels were more in the West End, and they were the oldest hotels, so there's no science in deciding which hotels kept their licence. They just went to the oldest. The first one, you keep it. The last one, you lost your licence. But Freemasons was the newest hotel in Fremantle at that time, so that's why that was recognised. So there'd been widespread opposition to the new Act, which culminated in a large public meeting in Perth on the 6th of August 1856. This was the biggest public meeting that had ever been held in the colony, and with people coming from all the principal towns in the colony, the crowd was estimated to be over 400 people. So a lot of people, public opposition to the government's legislation. A number of resolutions were passed at that meeting which opposed it. However, at that time, Governor Kennedy's own troubles with the legislation weren't to go away, for it was ironic that on the very day the public meeting was held, a concert was held by the Total Abstinence Society, which was attended by the government. This concert was also well attended, with about 200 people in attendance. But in the course of the evening, the governor made an unintended gaffe, no doubt made worse by the Perth Gazette's reporting of his speech. For as the paper reported, His Excellency gave some statistics on the drinking habits of the people of the colony, alluded to the Publicans Licensing Act, and complimented the country visitors by declaring the inhabitants of the rural districts to be the greatest drunkards in the colony. So that didn't help his impression of his image at all. That report only made the governor more unpopular with the country people, and he had to rely on the standard politician's defence of being quoted out of context. So as I come to the end of this presentation, it could be said that those first 6 years of the 1850s could well be regarded as the first golden age of hotel keeping in Fremantle. For us to be another 30 years before Fremantle again had 9 hotels, and it was to be 40 years before Fremantle again enjoyed such prosperous times as those that had been enjoyed in the first few years of the 1850s. However, before I conclude my talk, there is one other quote that I would like to share with you. The quote is from Marcus Clarke. Does anybody recognise that name? He's who wrote the novel For the Turtle's Natural Life. And his own biography showed that he's an English man, died at a young age of drink-related illnesses. But there is a time when he compares us Australians to other national groups. And I'm going to conclude with this quote now. He described us, he makes this comparison, he says about us Aussies. He said, they are not a nation of snobs like the English, or of extravagant boasters like the Americans, or of reckless degenerates like the French. They are simply a nation of drunkards.